Have you ever heard of 996? It means working from 9 a.m. to 9 p.m., 6 days a week. Honestly, even though I work at the Korean branch, the Chinese employees come in on Saturdays for meetings. With US sanctions, China had to become self-sufficient in hardware and software. If they couldn't sell products anymore, I think this was born out of a desperate need. I think the United States might have made a mistake there. We don't consider China as a benchmarking target, right? So thinking that China is still a country following us is, in my opinion, a misconception. Now, China is also a country that should be benchmarked. Many people still think we're far ahead of China, but there are many areas where that's not the case.
Hello everyone, I'm Professor Jae-Hong Choi. Today we have a special guest, the Vice President of Huawei. Recently, China has been facing what some call a DeepSeek wave, and at the same time we're seeing efforts to find new ways forward. So today we'll explore what we can learn from these developments and ask some pressing questions. Welcome, it's a pleasure to have you here.
Thanks for having me.
Long time no see.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
Not at all. It's just that given the delicate nature of this relationship, I thought talking about China might be a bit tricky. But I truly appreciate you being here today. To start, could you introduce yourself?
I'm currently the CSO of Huawei Korea, a position I've held for nearly 5 years.
What kind of work were you involved in before this role?
My first job was at Samsung, where I worked for about 10 years. After that, I moved to Daum, which later merged with Kakao, and I served as the CIO there. I was in charge of the overall infrastructure for about 7 years. Then I transitioned to Naver, where I worked for 8 years as the CISO, overseeing security as the Chief Security Officer.
In Korea, there are some negative perceptions about China, and that sentiment has grown over time. Have you ever felt scrutinized or faced any personal challenges because of this?
Even now, when I say I work at Huawei, some people shy away thinking of it as just a company from a communist country. But I see it differently. I'm from a generation that watched Sony's rise. And there was a time when Samsung worked hard to catch up with them. Now I realize that if we're not careful, we might end up like Sony. And that's the thought that comes to mind, realizing that they are now in Samsung's position, and we might be heading towards Sony's path. So I believe it's important to study what they're doing. When thinking about Huawei's strength, one key factor stands out. The company has around 200,000 employees worldwide, and more than half of them are in R&D.
That's something I really wanted to ask about. 10 years ago, when I was studying Huawei, I was shocked to learn that they had around 40,000 researchers at the time. I even heard there was a building in Shenzhen housing all of them. But recently, I came across something even more surprising. Apparently, they now have a research facility the size of 100 soccer fields.
You're probably referring to the new research center built in Shanghai. The headquarters is in Shenzhen, where they have their original campus from the early days. About an hour north, there's another city called Dongguan, where Huawei has a huge R&D campus. Interestingly, they've built it to look like famous European landmarks. So there's a French section with French-style buildings, an Italian section with Italian architecture, and so on. So around 30,000 researchers currently work at this campus, supported by another 5,000 staff members.
So that means in Shenzhen, there are around 40,000 R&D staff. And if the new Shanghai facility is roughly the size of 100 soccer fields,
including their other locations, that's easily over 100,000 people just in R&D.
Here's another interesting fact. Our current branch manager was born in 1984. So he's in his early 40s. But the funny thing is, most employees actually leave the company around age 45. I mean, officially, you can stay much longer until the retirement age, but practically everyone is gone by the time they're 45.
there are pros and cons.
I found out that it's not just Huawei that operates like this, but also well-known companies like Alibaba and Tencent are doing the same.
You're quite a bit older, aren't you?
It's possible because I'm in a foreigner position.
Oh, really?
Right, since I'm in a foreigner role.
Suddenly that sounds pretty good. I mean, look at China. They've got young CEOs, young researchers pouring millions into AI these days. Did you hear that Tsinghua University alone has more AI students than Korea has AI researchers altogether? Crazy, right?
Back in 2016, when it came to top-level science, almost all the best universities were in the US, Harvard, Stanford, MIT. Japan was also up there with the University of Tokyo. Then you've got Oxford and Cambridge from the UK, UC Berkeley, again from the US, and ETH Zurich from Switzerland. Beijing University in China ranked 9th, followed by Michigan at 10th.
That was from 10 years ago, right?
This was in 2016. At the time, Seoul National University ranked around 56th and KAIST about 60th. And if we look at last year's rankings, the top spot still belongs to Harvard.
But from 2nd to 9th place, they are all Chinese universities. Well, Chinese Academy of Sciences University, then University of Science and Technology of China, Peking University, Nanjing University, Zhejiang University, Tsinghua University, Sun Yat-sen University, Shanghai Jiao Tong University. And at 10th, there's the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Seoul National University is 54th and KAIST is 76th. That's how the rankings have changed.
It might vary a bit depending on which organization you ask, but either way, that's an important takeaway. Speaking of which, Huawei sales have been surging lately. Is there any specific reason behind that?
As I mentioned earlier, Huawei saw a huge drop in sales because of the US sanctions. Their smartphone business took the biggest hit. They were blocked from using Android OS, and on top of that, Huawei was prevented from accessing the 4G and 5G chips needed to build their smartphones. So basically, production ground to a halt. But now they've become self-sufficient and are making even pricier phones. An iPhone costs around 2 million won, but those Huawei phones go for about 5 million. So expensive, they're hard to get.
Oh, you mean that 3-fold and triple folding phone, right?
When I checked out that double folding phone, I thought, wow, this would be amazing for watching YouTube. But then I saw the price. It was around 4.5 million won.
On the black market, it goes for over 10 million won.
I couldn't even imagine buying.
I vividly remember attending MWC back in 2013. At the time, people dismissed Chinese brands as knockoffs or cheap alternatives. Then around 2015, the narrative shifted to good value for money. Now even that doesn't apply anymore. These days, they're actually more expensive.
Oh, that's right. Now, one thing that struck me after joining Huawei is just how incredibly adaptable the company is. They pivot their strategies so quickly. Usually, if sales drop in one business area, most companies take forever to find new opportunities and recover. But Huawei somehow manages to shift gears almost immediately. I saw them moving very quickly. When their sales dropped due to US sanctions, they immediately jumped into entirely new areas, like automotive, a sector they hadn't even touched before. And then suddenly there's digital power, which involves all sorts of equipment for data centers. These new ventures popped up almost overnight, and the speed at which they rolled them out was genuinely astonishing.
What's the reason for that? Here's how I see it. Have you ever heard of the 996?
Google?
Number 996.
It's the Chinese working style. Start work at 9 o'clock and leave work at 9 o'clock, 6 days a week.
996. That's not something people in Korea would like to hear. Honestly, even though I'm working at the Korean branch, our Chinese colleagues actually come in on Saturdays for meetings.
I personally ignore it since I'm local here in Korea, but for Chinese employees, Saturday meetings have become the norm. They regularly come in and work as if it's just another weekday.
If talented people start pouring in that much time, how can anyone keep up?
That young employee probably does 996, or might even work harder than that.
There's this young guy I know who went to Shenzhen as an intern at Tencent, and apparently they never really leave the office. These interns come from top universities like Tsinghua, Shanghai University, Jiao Tong University, places far from home. Plus, as mentioned earlier, the company campus has about 30,000 to 40,000 people with swimming pools, free food, even movie theaters, so there's no reason to leave. And they don't have friends or family around. So the entire life revolves around the office. It's not even 996 anymore. It's basically 24/7. But wait, we might get in trouble with people here working hard under the 52-hour rule. Let's just clarify. We're simply talking about how things are in China, nothing more.
I think that's definitely a factor that could leave you behind in the competition.
Even CEOs rotate like that, right?
There's a founder and beneath him, 3 rotating chairmen. These 3 take turns leading the company, each specializing in different areas. They rotate every 6 months. So for example, if one chairman handles finance, the others would oversee different departments. And then someone else handled like the IT department, and another person handled sales. And this changes every 6 months. So maybe they can correct what's wrong and bring new perspectives and change without being complacent. I think that's why they rotate like this.
Every 6 months. So you could argue that effectively passing down management expertise usually takes much longer experience.
Of course, 3 chairmen have been there a long time. So it's really just the final decision maker who changes every 6 months. They all fully understand the business anyway.
Even though they rotate every 6 months, they've each done these roles before, so their experience is pretty unique. By the way, speaking of that triple foldable phone, I often go to MWC, so I'll probably see it again soon. When folded, it's basically just a regular smartphone, and it's surprisingly thin too. Then when you unfold it completely, it basically turns into a tablet or even a laptop. And to think, all of this was made using Chinese technology. Recently, Huawei has been developing its own AI chips, HBM chips, and even its own operating system. Do you think there's a specific reason why they're trying so hard to build this kind of vertically integrated system?
It's definitely because of the US sanctions. Like I mentioned earlier with smartphones, almost everyone, including Samsung, uses Android as their OS. But the US completely blocked Chinese companies from using Android, leaving Huawei no choice but to develop its own operating system. That reminds me, Korea also tried to create its own version of Windows and even its own Microsoft at one point, right? But ultimately, those efforts didn't work out. Huawei quickly created their own operating system called Harmony OS, basically their version of Android. When I asked users about it, they said it actually runs pretty smoothly without major issues. Sure, Harmony OS still has fewer apps and some compatibility problems compared to Android, but it's impressive how quickly they've adapted. Because of the US sanctions, we have to be self-sufficient in both hardware and software. So, the vertical integration you mentioned means that if we can't produce it ourselves, we can't sell products anymore. I think it was done out of desperation, and I feel like the US might have made a mistake there.
From what I've seen, even the high-performance H100 GPU was put under export restrictions, forcing companies to use lower performance versions. Ironically, that limitation pushed them to innovate even more urgently, creating entirely new solutions out of sheer necessity.
Currently, the H100 is still the highest-end GPU available, costing around $30,000. Earlier, you mentioned DeepSeek using NVIDIA's H800, but they're not just relying on NVIDIA. They've also incorporated Huawei's Ascend 900 series. Huawei isn't yet capable of making chips at the ultra-high performance level of the H100, but it seems they can produce AI accelerators similar to the H800. What's really interesting is the price. Huawei's Ascend chips cost only about 1/3 of NVIDIA's A100, roughly around 10 million won. Even though they're lower in specs, they're extremely competitive price-wise.
Well, one of the reasons I invited you is because I was genuinely shocked by DeepSeek going open source. It's kind of ironic, isn't it? A socialist country ended up democratizing AI. When I'm reading the report closely, the main takeaway was clear. Now anyone can easily, cheaply, and conveniently access AI technology. China's actually played a big role in making that happen.
What's truly astonishing is that DeepSeek is just one of around 200 AI models currently running in China. Huawei doesn't just make AI accelerators, they also develop their own AI models. For example, their weather prediction AI made headlines by cutting analysis times down dramatically, from 2 weeks to just a single day. They're creating models of that caliber now. Ultimately, I think behind all this rapid innovation is the sheer power of human talent and effort.
One major difference is that here in Korea, young people are so focused on getting into medical schools, but in China, the younger generation overwhelmingly prefers engineering over medicine. It's a completely different trend.
China is investing heavily in scientific fields, especially space exploration. At the core of these fields are basic sciences like physics and mathematics. But honestly, here in Korea, how many young people do you see choosing to major in physics or math? I genuinely believe outstanding talent needs to engage with foundational sciences to achieve breakthroughs. And it's really unfortunate that we're not seeing that happen enough here. I know this might be different from what many young people and their parents here in Korea want to hear. Medical school is the top priority.
I was trying to laugh it off lightly, but honestly, it's a pretty serious concern.
That's right.
The reason Korea grew so rapidly was always about the talent and capability of its people. But recently, when you look at China, BYD announced they'd offer their autonomous driving system, the one they call God's Eye, completely free.
I mean, Tesla charges tens of thousands of dollars for similar software, and now China is giving it away for nothing.
Just to give you an example, I'm actually a huge Apple fan myself.
Now that you mention it, you don't use a Chinese phone.
I'm an Apple user through and through, but recently I switched to Huawei earbuds. I've been using AirPods, of course, but they started hurting my ears after a while. These Huawei ones, though, they sit comfortably without blocking your ears, and the sound quality is fantastic. So I just walked straight into a Huawei store and bought them. Guess how much they cost?
Well, Apple earbuds usually run around 200,000 to 300,000 won. If they're cheaper, I'd guess maybe around 100,000 something won.
It's 250,000 won. But
At first, I thought Chinese products would be cheap, but that's not the case.
when I showed these earbuds to my friends, their first reaction was like, "Are you crazy? Why would Chinese earbuds cost 250,000 won?" But the truth is, you can't really judge them without hearing the sound quality yourself. They actually have excellent audio drivers and deliver premium sound, making them genuinely worth the price. Still, our mindset is stuck in this idea that Chinese products must be cheap. even though that's not true anymore. Recently, I went on a business trip to our headquarters located in Shenzhen, China. As you probably know, Shenzhen is right next to Hong Kong, so close that you can just hop on the subway and easily go between the two cities. In fact, if I were to compare Shenzhen to Korea, it's basically like our Pangyo area. Of course, it's much larger. Shenzhen has a population of over 20 million people. It's a good comparison to Pangyo here in Korea.
So, when you go to Shenzhen, you'll notice that cars have license plates in two different colours. One is blue and the other is green. The green plates mean it's an electric car. From what I can see, the ratio of electric cars to regular cars is about 50/50.
BYD cars are the cheapest and are planning to enter South Korea soon.
One night I tried calling a ride in China using their version of Uber, which is called Didi. When the car showed up, it felt like I was getting into a high-end European car. The whole experience was surprisingly upscale. So I asked the interpreter to check how much the car cost. Turns out it was about 30 million won, but I was thinking, this feels off. It feels like a high-end European car. The interior was pretty nice, and I thought to myself, if this car were imported to Korea for that price, I'd actually consider buying it. Instead, Huawei cars focus on developing the self-driving software, while the hardware is made in partnership with other car companies. The cars that Huawei sells aren't in the 30 million won range. They go for much higher prices, around 50 million, 70 million, or even 100 million won. I actually got to test drive one with self-driving features, and I was really impressed by how advanced the technology is. You could really feel the difference in quality. But if you look at Korean YouTube channels, all you see are negative takes, stuff like BYD is nothing special, or their cars catch fire all the time. That's the kind of news that gets highlighted. But when you step back and see the bigger picture, it's clear. This is a serious game changer.
I personally thought to myself, if cars like these were to come into Korea, our local car industry might be in serious trouble. This is a warning, but right now it almost seems like you're doing product placement for Chinese cars and products. Not at all. It's not about that kind of meaning. Rather, it's about giving customers the freedom to choose safer, more comfortable, affordable, and better products. I noticed the same thing when I visited Arab countries. BYD was advertising like crazy, and lately I've been seeing massive BYD billboards in the US as well. Even here in Korea, BYD has started ramping up its ads. I always tell my students that you have to try an iPhone to truly understand what makes a Galaxy phone feel different, both the good and the bad. It's all about comparison. So in that sense, I completely agree. Recently, there's been a lot of talk about DeepSeek, and with that comes a growing emphasis on security and data protection. People worry whether their personal data might get leaked. Since you're an expert in security, what's your take on this? Could you share your thoughts on this issue?
Whether it's ChatGPT or DeepSeek, if a company uses it, there's a risk of information leaks. It doesn't matter if it's a Chinese product or an American one. Because of such security leaks, some companies completely block external sites. Many companies are now opting to implement these technologies internally. For example, with ChatGPT, businesses concerned about security can set up their own servers and data storage to run it privately. There are enterprise solutions available for this, but of course it comes with a higher cost. On-premises systems may cost more than using the cloud, but they can offer stronger security. Honestly, the reason people are making a bigger fuss over DeepSeek than ChatGPT is simply because it's a Chinese product. We still have this lingering perception that Chinese tech is somehow unstable or that it might steal our data. It's likely that some of this stems from a broader sense of resistance or skepticism toward China. But no matter where the product is made, if you put the company's information in there, it can take everything.
Alibaba, Baidu, Tencent, and Huawei mainly focus on their massive domestic market of 1.5 billion people. But do you think that creates challenges when expanding globally? Since you're based at an overseas branch, what's your perspective on this?
Professor, have you ever thought about standards like centimeters, length, area? These are all standardized measurements. Having a universal standard is what allows things to be used globally. When I visited Huawei, I saw that they are heavily involved in shaping and participating in global standards. Right now, we're still ahead of China in terms of setting these standards, but I can't shake the feeling that before long, China might dominate the entire standards landscape. It's a bit alarming.
Working at a Chinese company, yet calling it a crisis. Still feeling patriotic.
Well, working at a Chinese company makes me feel torn. On one hand, if the company does well, I'll get paid well, which is obviously a good thing. But as a Korean, there are times when it really doesn't sit well with me. It leaves me wondering, what should I do? Going back to what we talked about earlier, it all starts with standards. Every product is designed to meet global standards, which is why they already have a competitive edge worldwide.
Being actively involved in setting these standards means they're creating products that align with what the global market demands.
It's not just about price, it's about meeting global standards, which naturally leads to globalization.
I think they analyze demand in those markets and develop products accordingly.
What I really want to ask here, the most important question is, what should we do? Lately, with the whole Temu wave, I've been thinking about this. I tried using Temu in the US, and apparently they fly in shipments by air. Even in Korea, Temu operates, and somehow their prices are a tenth or even a 20th of the usual market rates. They're reportedly running billion-dollar deficits, yet they're still shaking up global e-commerce. What's going on here? Have you ever used Temu?
Yeah, I've tried Temu before. I bought some stuff, but honestly, I ended up throwing it all away. The quality was terrible, really disappointing. That's actually something I've looked into on my own. I was curious about why they're selling things so cheaply, and from what I found, right now China's economy is struggling in many areas, especially due to the impact of US policies. A lot of global companies that once had factories in China are now pulling out, which is leading to massive job losses. There are domestic companies that rely on the local market, and they have to keep their operations running no matter what. But the reality is, I think the current situation in China is that companies have been producing way too much, leading to massive stockpiles of inventory. It seems like they're dealing with a serious oversupply problem.
So is Temu or AliExpress clearing out this stock?
They need to push all that excess inventory out to other countries. And I believe Alibaba and Tencent are the ones leading that effort.
Honestly, like you said, a lot of people end up tossing a good chunk of what they buy, thinking, what is this? But they don't bother with refunds because the prices are just so cheap. Maybe that's exactly what these companies are banking on. I also heard that because China is such a huge market, products are often made cheaply and there's little emphasis on after-sales service. The mindset seems to be just use it for a while and throw it away, right?
Exactly. When something's that cheap, it's just not worth the hassle of after-sales service.
The reason I invited you here today is to ask, what should we do? Let me give you an example. A student of mine once interned at Tencent, and after the experience, he came to me and said, Professor, I have no idea how we're supposed to compete with China. He was blown away by the sheer talent, the work ethic, and the level of investment in people. The way Tencent nurtures its talent is incredible. It reminded them of Amazon's approach, where they recruit the best, treat us the best, and develop them into top-tier professionals. China is doing it that way, so what do? I was asked this once, so what I said was, hey, don't fight the dragon, ride its back. Why are you trying to compete with them?
Like I mentioned earlier, working at a Chinese company gives me mixed feelings. Looking back, I remember when I first joined Samsung in 1992, after my military service. Most of my business trips back then were for benchmarking.
So just like the US at the time, China needed to keep its factories running. I think that's why they started looking into things like Toyota's Six Sigma methodology.
But today we don't see China as a country to benchmark. We still think of them as the ones following us, and honestly, I believe that's a mistake.
Mistake?
Even if we're not benchmarking them directly, we still need to understand them. You can't develop a strategy without knowing your competition, but instead of trying to understand China, we're just shutting them out. Some people won't even meet with Huawei representatives just because they're Huawei. But that's not the right approach. The smart move is to sit down with them, ask questions and learn. How does China operate? How does Huawei do business? That's the only way to find the right answers. Yet we're doing none of that. We're not benchmarking China at all.
I have to admit, that makes me reflect as well. I've never really tried benchmarking a Chinese company myself.
China is now a country we need to benchmark. You need to know your enemy to figure out how to respond. That's why my advice is simple. Know your enemy, benchmark them.
Elle, when we say enemy, we don't mean it in a hostile way. This is about competition. China is no longer just following us. They've already surpassed us in some areas. That's why we need to analyze and understand them properly.
Let me share a quick story. There's always talk about Huawei equipment having backdoors and demands for them to reveal their source code. So I decided to ask the headquarters directly. Can you provide the source code? Their response? Of course we can.
Oh, really?
But there was something they were concerned about. They didn't say it outright, but the worry wasn't about handing over the source code to organizations like our National Intelligence Service or other government agencies. They were fine with that. What they were really worried about was it ending up somewhere else. And where do you think that might be?
Competitor, right?
On the contrary, Samsung was a time when telecom equipment was just being developed to catch up with Huawei. So Samsung was in a position of following. Therefore, I would like to say that we have reached the point where we are worried that the source code of the world's best telecom equipment might be leaked to competitors.
Looking at the market share in telecom equipment, Huawei is firmly in first place, while Samsung Electronics is much further down the list. The gap is huge. Samsung's share fluctuates around 5%, while Huawei holds a dominant 30 to 40%. In a way, the comparison isn't even fair. There have even been reports stating that Samsung has only been able to hold on because of the sanctions on Huawei. Technologically, Huawei is far ahead. That's the kind of analysis we're seeing in the media.
Many people in our country still believe we're far ahead of China, but the reality is there are many areas where that's no longer the case. The more I look into it, the clearer this becomes.
We've had a long and insightful conversation with our Vice President today. One thing is clear. China is no longer a country, a technology, or a workforce that we can simply dismiss. China is right next to us, and in many areas they're already far ahead of us. There are numerous fields where they've surpassed us. Maybe it's time we start looking at things from a different perspective. Instead of focusing solely on stable careers like going to medical school, young people in China are driven by a strong spirit of challenge and innovation. In that sense, we might need to do some serious reflection, and perhaps there's a lot we can learn from them. Vice President, could you give us some final thoughts to wrap up our discussion?
Since you're deeply interested in startups, let's be realistic. Thinking you can succeed by only targeting the Korean market is not enough. You need a global mindset. The scale of our market is simply too small. Take Huawei as an example. Out of its massive 180 trillion won in annual revenue, Korea's contribution is barely noticeable. From Huawei's perspective, Korea wasn't so much a key sales market, it was more valuable as part of their supply chain. Before US sanctions, Huawei used to purchase 14 trillion won worth of goods from Korea every year, mainly displays and semiconductors. At one point, Huawei alone accounted for 6.6% of Korea's exports to China. But that relationship has collapsed. Now our dynamic with China has shifted from collaboration to direct competition. The problem is if we stay too focused on our small domestic market, we simply won't have the scale to compete with them. So once again, my key message is this. Benchmark them, study them, learn from them. That's the only way forward.
Looks like I need to visit Shenzhen as well.
You're always welcome. Feel free to visit any time. Shenzhen can feel like a glimpse into the future. I think it would be a great experience for you to see it firsthand.
Anyway, thank you so much for your time today. I know you're busy with work, so I truly appreciate it. It's been a pleasure having you here.
Thanks for having me.